Botticelli's most significant patrons were not in the end the Vespucci, but an even wealthier and more powerful Florentine family, those fabulously potent Firenze bankers, the Medici, who essentially ruled the city. And this rather gloomy rural retreat was owned by one of the lesser Medici, Lorenzo di Pierfrancesco de' Medici. Essentially, this was his summer house, and somewhere in here, we don't know where, Botticelli's Birth of Venus used to hang. We don't know how it got here, we don't know when it got here, and we're not sure why it got here. But we do know that it used to hang somewhere in this gloomy rural retreat, alongside yet another of Botticelli's remarkable love nest of Venuses. I hope you're feeling clever, because this painting takes a lot of keeping up with. It's called La Primavera, the spring, and it features Venus again. She's the one standing in the middle, rather quietly, but we know it's her because there's Cupid, her son, firing off arrows of love above her head. Over here, very important figure, because the picture really moves from this side to the other side. Over here, blowing out his cheeks, is Zephyr, the god of the west wind. Now, Zephyr is blowing away winter and therefore, as it were, ushering in the spring. And as you can see, he's chasing this nymph here. She's Chloris. Zephyr fell in love with Chloris, but Chloris wasn't interested. He took her anyway. And what's happening is that the act of taking Chloris results in her transformation, because she changes into Flora, the goddess of spring. Venus, as we said, is in the middle with Cupid above her, and she's attended by her usual attendants, the three Graces, joyously dancing. And over here, finally, is Mercury, waving his wand at the clouds to dispel them, and therefore preparing for the spring again. Now, he is probably a slightly disguised portrait of Lorenzo de' Medici, Lorenzo the Magnificent, as he was called. If it is him, he's the one who commissioned this picture, and if he commissioned it, he probably did it because one of his cousins, Lorenzo di Pierfrancesco de' Medici, who lived in the Villa di Castello, was getting married, and this painting was meant to be an encouragement to him, and indeed it was meant to provide advice about fertility and how to bring out the best in your bride. It could be that the bride was a touch reluctant, like Chloris, and that she had to be forced into the marriage. But even if she was, it results in all this. In this astonishing, blooming, wonderful, flower-filled spring. This is one of the world's greatest ever evocations of fertility. Now remember, this used to hang too alongside the Birth of Venus in the Villa di Castello. So are there any clues here to the kind of meaning we should be expecting from the Birth of Venus? Of course there are. The Mona Lisa has mystery. The Venus de Milo has a great body. But Botticelli's Venus has the whole package. Mystery, a great body, hair that could drive a man wild with entanglement, and something else. An X factor. I've been puzzling over what this X factor might be for a couple of decades now. Coming over to Florence, trying to work out why this particular woman toots so many people's horns. And I've come to believe that what gets us in the end is her vulnerability. Sure, all us guys want to jump into that picture with her and study some Latin, but we also want to protect her, to wrap that cloak about her. She's come out of her shell on this blustery day, so cold, so fragile, so hesitant, and she looks so exposed. She needs us. Botticelli's Venus makes us feel wanted. That amusing English poet, Alexander Pope, who was much taken with beautiful women, wrote once about a particularly gorgeous lady at court. Has she no faults then? Somebody asks him in the poem. Yes, she has one, I must aver, replies Pope. When all the world conspires to praise her, the woman's deaf and does not hear. Doesn't that remind you of Botticelli's Venus? She's outrageously beautiful, yet so embroiled is she in her own thoughts that she appears to be deaf to our praises and can't even hear our tongues hitting the tabletop at the sight of her.
When you first look at her, you think she's beautiful. But when you actually study her, there are two particular things that are sort of wrong with her. It is to do with her left shoulder. If you think about it and actually study the painting, her left shoulder is uncomfortably low. I'll do this Quasimodo interpretation. You can see it actually sort of does that down there. But the neck and the shoulder together do look slightly strange when your eye concentrates upon them. And for me, the strange bit is looking at her foot as it stands on the shell, where there's a sort of bump, in that way that slightly old ladies get bumps when they try and put their slightly large feet into small shoes. And my eye is often drawn to that. And then I think, oh, I forgive him, she's been on the shell a long time, and maybe she's got cramp or whatever. But funnily enough, it's not an anatomically beautiful body, but it is an aesthetically incredibly pleasing one.
She was painted in around 1485, maybe for Lorenzo di Pierfrancesco again. What is obvious is that this modesty she has, that shyness, the Lady Di look, is definitely intentional. We know this because her pose is based directly on a Roman statue owned by the Medici, the so-called Venus Pudica, or modest Venus. This Roman Venus covers herself up and hides her bits. She symbolises the sort of modesty that Florentines demanded of their women, particularly when they entered into marriage. So, although Botticelli's Venus is naked, indeed, she's the first great mythological nude of the Renaissance, and she's nearly life-size to boot. Despite all that, the effect Botticelli wanted to convey with her was surely one of modesty, not of exposure.
Though I don't think Botticelli's Birth of Venus is meant to be erotic, there is no doubt that she does open the door in Western art to the nude as carnal. And you only have to go 50 years down the line to Titian painting the Venus of Urbino, where you have a beautiful naked woman lying on a couch, incredibly aware of her own erotic teasing, and sort of saying, I am available sexually. And there begins such a great and terrible history of Western art and the female nude, which is about men looking at her and her needing to be desired. Now, I don't think Botticelli did that with Venus. I think that face still has a self-containment of the knowledge of some spirituality to it. But certainly once the cat is out of the bag, once the clothes are off the body, you can't control where it goes.
This is Hesiod's Theogony. It's the classical text that most clearly describes the birth of Venus. It's a hell of a story, blood-curdling. Uranus, the god of the sky, was being a beast to his mother and lover, Gaia, the earth. So Gaia persuaded their son, Kronos, a titan, to sneak up on Uranus while he was making love to Gaia and to cut off his testicles. Kronos then chucked these genitals into the sea. He lopped them off with a flint and threw them from the mainland into the great wash of the seawater, and they drifted a while on the open sea and there spread into a circle of white foam. and from this circle of white foam grew a girl, Venus, or Aphrodite as she was first called. Thus Venus was the nautical fruit of Uranus's frothing testicles. Now, unless my eyes are failing me completely, none of this bears any relation to anything we can see in the Botticelli. We've got naked Venus in a shell, the shell's in the sea, and she's surrounded by a cluster of mythological figures. But surely no one here is being born. No frothing, no castration, no testicles. Yet if this isn't the birth of Venus, as we've been misinformed for hundreds of years, what else could it be? Let's have a close look at all this nature on show here, this excellent horticulture. There's plenty of it, and it's all meaningful. This little plant here between her legs, that's an anemone, a lovely spring favourite, which, according to legend, only grows when there's a warm wind. So the ancients used to call it the windflower. And lo and behold, up here in the corner is our old friend Zephyr, bringer of the warm wind and an inveterate blower. Zephyr isn't only blowing the anemone to life, look at all those roses pouring out of his mouth as well. The rose is specifically Venus's flower. The ancients believed that it only came into being at a very important moment, the first time Venus set foot on dry land. We've got the land here all right. These are orange trees, the ancient symbols of the Medici. And this figure here, she's probably one of the Horae, the embodiments of the seasons. She's the Horae of spring, I warrant. Look at these gorgeous cornflowers painted on her dress. And see here, she's wearing a girdle of roses. The Horae is handing a cloak to Venus so that the modest Venus can cover herself. So what does it all mean? Well, it means that the painting seems to celebrate an important arrival, an arrival that brings fertility. Is it therefore another marriage painting, joyously commissioned to celebrate the arrival in the Medici family of another fertile bride? I think so. But that's conjecture. What's certain is that this isn't the birth of Venus, it's her disembarkation. She's arrived somewhere on her shell, and when she touches the land, it blooms. What could this be then? Well, I think it's in here again. Hesiod's theogony. Having been born of Uranus's testicles and drifted across the sea, Venus made her way to sea-washed Cyprus and stepped ashore, a modest, lovely goddess, and about her slender feet the grass grew. So, the painting we've been calling The Birth of Venus ought properly to be called Venus, having been born of Uranus's testicles, arrives in Cyprus and makes things grow. But for some reason, that title never caught on. There are a million stories in the world of art. This has been just one of them. There are paintings whose meaning is a mystery. There are painters who led mysterious lives, but only rarely, very rarely, do we encounter an utterly mysterious painting by an utterly mysterious painter. That's the case with The Tempest, the masterpiece by Giorgio da Castelfranco, better known to you and me as Giorgione. Tempest hangs in the Accademia Gallery in Venice, a city packed with great pictures. But so precious is The Tempest that they wouldn't even let us into the same room to film it.
This is an icon of Western culture and is possibly the best conserved of Giorgione's works still in existence. Entire books have been written about the content of this painting, which can be interpreted at various different levels.
For 500 years, The Tempest has led its many admirers on a wild goose chase. To this day, there is no agreement about what we're actually witnessing when we look at it. Who is she? Who is he? What are they doing? And where are they? Although Giorgione is considered perhaps Venice's greatest painter, he wasn't actually from Venice. He came from the Venetian mainland, the Veneto as it's called, a land of dark hills, mysterious mists, and silhouetted castles, whose poetic presence always haunts the backgrounds of his art. Castelfranco, where young Giorgio was born in 1477, is a pretty medieval city, surrounded by a moat. We know Giorgio came from a humble family, that he was tall and imposing, which is how he got his nickname, Giorgione, Big George. Big George's earliest work in Castelfranco is now in ruins. It's a puzzling frieze of musical instruments and astronomical diagrams painted in the house of a local nobleman. Like so much of Giorgione's art, the Castelfranco frieze seems to speak to us in riddles. At an early age, he left Castelfranco for Venice, where he quickly made his mark with these mysterious fantasies filled with poetic longing for the Veneto. But there's a problem. We know Giorgione's art was revolutionary, that he had many followers and was much copied, but we don't know exactly what he painted. None of his work is signed, not even The Tempest.
Unlike other painters of Renaissance Italy, very little is known about him, except for the date of his death and a few dates of some of his paintings. But when we know the date, the painting is lost, and when we have the painting, we have no date. With one exception, there is only one painting in Vienna, Laura, which is dated on the back of it at 1506. So it's a very mysterious painter.
We know almost nothing about Giorgione's life. We know that he lived in this square in Venice, that he played the lute beautifully, that he was very handsome, that women liked him, and that, perhaps as a result, he died young. It seems that his handsome looks and his beautiful lute playing brought him to the attention of a certain Venetian lady. She caught the plague. Giorgione, while conducting this illicit affair with her, caught it too. He died in 1510, aged a little over 30, but he'd done enough. He'd changed the course of art. Like no one before him, Giorgione was to feed the Venetian appetite for melancholy ambiguity. It's an appetite the inhabitants of Venice seem to inherit with their mother's milk. The city itself, a floating labyrinth decaying before our eyes, is a puzzle waiting to be solved.
People like to look up and discover in the same place different things that they have possibly never seen before. This happens even to us Venetians. Whenever we look up or look around, we discover something new.
We'd know more about Giorgione, a lot more, if what he painted on the outside of this unnaturally blank building hadn't crumbled into the water. This used to be the warehouse of the German merchants in Venice. Once it was completely covered with frescoes by Giorgione. Today, it's Venice's main post office. And only this tiny decayed fragment remains. The Tempest was painted just before Giorgione's horribly premature death in 1510. We know it was probably commissioned by Gabriele Vendramin, a member of one of Venice's most powerful families. This is Vendramin as an old man, painted by Titian, who was always thought to have been Giorgione's pupil. But notice the cross in this painting. It's terribly important. This cross, which still exists behind this golden door, was thought to contain a fragment of the actual cross on which Jesus was crucified. Yet one day, to the city's horror, it was dropped accidentally into this canal in Venice and sank to the bottom. No one could find it until Gabrielle's famed ancestor, Andrea Vendramin, plunged into the water and fished it out. It was a miracle, or so the Venetians believed. Their cross was safe. The miracle of the cross gave the Vendramin family great fame in Venice, though you wouldn't know it today. I tracked down the family palace and found it to be a simple hardware store. Looking around at the nuts and the bolts, it was impossible to imagine that in this building, Giorgione's Tempest was to hang, largely unseen, for 400 years. We don't know how Gabriele Vendramin came to acquire the Tempest. He probably commissioned it directly from the painter. 20 years after Giorgione's death, a visitor to Vendramin's palace remembers seeing a little landscape with a storm, with a gypsy and a soldier by Giorgio of Castelfranco. Already, the Tempest's real meaning was lost. So perhaps it never had one.
Tempest is a very mysterious painting, and this is proved by the very fact that there are 30 to 40 different interpretations of it. One of them being that it has no meaning at all. This is one interpretation like the others. From some contemporary sources, we gather that the sort of patrons like Gabriele Vendramin, who owned the painting in the 1520s, loved to have guests in their homes and to show them some paintings like this and to play with them whether they would understand or not. This is the reason why many scholars, including myself, a vast majority of scholars, including myself, believe that a meaning was intended, whether we are able to understand it or not, but that the meaning was intended.
Vendramin never sold the Tempest. He left a will forbidding his heirs from selling it too. For the next 300 years, hardly anyone saw it. One visitor to Venice who did was the poet Lord Byron. It became his favourite painting and obsessed him. Byron believed the Tempest was a portrait of Giorgione himself, with his family. "'Tis but a portrait of his son and wife and self," he wrote. But Byron had a taste for other people's wives, and he fell in love with the woman he took to be Giorgione's spouse. "Such a woman, love in life," he drawled. In 1932, the Italian state finally bought the painting, and it's hung in the Accademia ever since, daring all comers to guess its true meaning. Interpreting the Tempest has become one of the great cottage industries of art history. But somewhere out there, there's a solution, and that solution must lie in the painting itself. Guess what? I think I found it. So what do we see in The Tempest? The setting looks much like Castelfranco itself, underneath a stormy sky with lightning in it. There's a beautiful mother suckling a baby, and a most handsome young man, tall, finely dressed, who seems to be her partner. So was Byron right? Is this Giorgione and his family? No, it isn't. Although we know so little about Giorgione, we do amazingly know what he looked like. He painted a self-portrait in which he pretends to be King David slaying the giant Goliath. Not all the picture has survived, but the face that remains is clearly not the young man in The Tempest. So who is he? And was Byron right or wrong about what he said?
The soldier is in fact a comrade of the sock. If you look at his socks, you will see that they are different colors. The comrades of the sock were private associations, very common in the Venice of that time, of young hedonists who got together to act plays, enjoy themselves, accompany wedding processions.
But just because the chap in The Tempest is dressed as a fashionably louche Venetian, it doesn't mean that's what he represents. Venetian art liked to set things in the present, to take the Bible or the tales of the gods out of the distant past and make them real. Oh, how they liked their costumes, just as Byron does. Also hanging in the Accademia is this huge masterpiece by one of Giorgione's descendants, Veronese. It's called The Feast in the House of Levi, and it too is a painting with a checkered history. The Feast in the House of Levi isn't its original name. Its first name was The Last Supper, and what it actually shows is the most famous dinner ever eaten. We don't recognize it these days because Christ and his disciples are wearing contemporary clothes, and because many of the characters in the painting aren't really supposed to be there. There's no mention in the Bible of dwarfs and jesters attending the Last Supper. So could The Tempest, like Veronese's Feast at the House of Levi, be a secret religious painting? Professor Salvador Setis believes it is.
What I did is basically to read all the literature on the painting and to see what is meaningful in the painting and what is not, which means the man, the woman, the child, the columns which are there, a serpent which is hidden in a bush, the lightning in the sky. But since the lightning was widely used as a symbol of God in Giorgione's time, I assumed that there was an equivalence between God and the lightning. And it's a definite possibility that that actually the Tempest represents Adam and Eve with the first-born child, Cain, actually, and the serpent would be an allusion to the original sin. So all different elements would be explained.
But there's a major flaw in this surprising Adam and Eve theory. When the painting was cleaned, that serpent which Professor Setis claims to have located under this bush turned out to be nothing more than the root of a tree. Can this really be the Garden of Eden? I've looked at it on many occasions for many hours and never once felt any religious atmosphere. Over at the Accademia, they prefer the simplest of all explanations. Which of the many interpretations of the Tempest's meaning do you think is probably closest to the truth?
Nessuna.
None of them. None of them, none of them. I like Michele's one best of all, a storm with a gypsy who is feeding her child and a shepherd.
So everybody else has been wrong?
I don't know.
If the painting isn't Giorgione's family, if it doesn't mean nothing at all, if it isn't a religious image, what can it be? Well, there is one area in which the artists of Venice specialized and took particular delight: the stories of the gods, mythology. Above all, a lot of fun was had enjoying the antics of Zeus, the god of thunder, a master of disguise whose appetite for good-looking mortals was Clintonesquely insatiable. Here's Giorgione's pupil, Titian, showing Zeus disguised as a shower of gold coins, making love to the surprised Danae. Zeus had a different disguise for every affair. To seduce the nymph Callisto, he took the form of another woman, Diana the Huntress, a stimulating example of girl-on-girl mythology. To make it with Io, he came down as a barely visible cloud of excitement. And it wasn't just girls he went for. Attracted by young Ganymede, Zeus turned into an eagle and had his violent way with the boy. That lightning in the background of the Tempest must surely indicate the presence of Zeus, the god of thunder and thrower of lightning bolts. But he's not seducing the woman in the picture, is he? She seems to be the partner of the handsome young man. So what is Zeus doing here? After 500 years of mystery, I think I've cracked Giorgione's code. There is a story, and only one story, which fits snugly with what we see in The Tempest. It's outlined here by Homer in the Odyssey, the most celebrated of all classical poems. It concerns Demeter, the goddess of fertility, who made things grow. This is her, with her clothes on, but I think Giorgione's painted her in The Tempest with her clothes off. According to Homer, Demeter met a handsome mortal at a wedding called Iasion. Even though she was a goddess and he was human, they made love in a ploughed field and had a baby. That baby was Plautus, the god of wealth. Zeus, Demeter's brother, and complicatedly her former lover, who often enjoyed the embrace of mortals himself, was so angered by this illicit relationship between Demeter and Iasion that he killed Iasion with a lightning bolt, smote him with his bright thunder, says Homer. The Tempest shows the moment just before Zeus's deadly revenge. That's why the atmosphere is so charged. Demeter has given birth to the god of wealth, but Iasion is about to be hit by a deadly thunderbolt. His crime? He was a mortal who made love to a god. And we're like the audience at a Christmas pantomime who can see what's going to happen and who want to shout, "Look out! Look out!" Once you know the picture's overall meaning, every little detail falls into place. Demeter's unexpectedly blonde hair, there's not too many blondes in Venice, is described by Homer, who calls her fair-tressed Demeter, golden-haired Demeter. Poor Iasion has a broken column behind him. That's bad luck. Broken columns, even in cemeteries today, represent a life cut short. In classical art, Plautus, the god of wealth, was often shown as a baby boy in the arms of a woman. But the cleverest clue, so easy to overlook, is the mysterious white bird perched on the roof behind. One of Demeter's attributes, the things that appear in pictures next to her so you know it's her, is a crane. This beautiful white bird flies south in the spring to rear its young, so it represents fertility, like her. But the crane has another role in mythology. It's renowned for standing on one leg, so during the Renaissance, they believed that in its other foot it held a stone, and if it ever fell asleep, that stone would drop, hit it on the other leg, and wake it up. And so the crane became a symbol of vigilance. Always look around you. Be prepared for what happens next. It's exactly the kind of message that a rich man like Gabriel Vendramin, whom Plautus has so favoured, would keep on the walls of his study as a constant reminder of the fickleness of wealth. Here today, gone tomorrow. The Tempest is a warning. Watch out, because you never know where or when the lightning may strike. It's a good message for Gabriel Vendramin. It's a good message for all of us. There are a million stories in the world of art. This has been just one of them. The English countryside is a deceptive terrain. It looks so sweet, so friendly, so innocent, but it's none of those things. Anyone who's listened to a few episodes of The Archers will already know that dark stuff happens in the English countryside. Sharp of tooth, red of claw, it's a deadly battleground. The great English painter Thomas Gainsborough certainly knew this. He was a country boy, born and bred, a Suffolk lad. Gainsborough recognised that beneath the deceptively innocent surfaces of outdoor England, unpleasantness was thriving. Lives were being ruined. Greed was being shown. Voila, Gainsborough's masterpiece of outdoor Englishness, his famous double portrait of Mr. and Mrs. Andrews. Summer corn glistening in the sun, fluffy clouds scudding across the sky, English oaks dotting the horizon, and sitting in front of it all like a pair of giant spiders in the middle of a web, Mr. and Mrs. Andrews. Him with his big gun and his nonchalance. She with the most puzzlingly unpleasant expression in the whole of Gainsborough's art. If this woman invited me up to spend the weekend at her big country house, I don't think I'd accept. Something's going on here. It's a pretty scene, it's merry England, but something's going on here. This is Gainsborough's town, Sudbury in Suffolk, where Mr. Andrews and Gainsborough probably went to school together. It's a tea and cakes town these days, somewhere ye olde on the tourist circuit. But when Gainsborough was born here in 1727, this was a real slab of rural England, a cloth town in serious decline.
Daniel Defoe came and visited Sudbury quite early on in the century and thought that it was a very, very poor place, and with one or two rich people, and all the poor people may well eat the rich ones, he said. So it was quite a depressed town, and Sudbury has always been an earthy little working town, and its main industry has been weaving. And indeed the Gainsborough family were concerned with that, not only Gainsborough's father, but also his very much more successfully his uncle, but it was quite a shaky business, I think.
They made velvet here, Wool, of course, Sudbury is surrounded by sheep, and, interestingly, silk. This is Gainsborough's garden, and this beautiful old survivor is a mulberry tree planted here in 1610. It would have been handy for the Gainsboroughs to have a mulberry tree in the garden, because mulberry trees are what silkworms feed on, and the Gainsboroughs were in the cloth trade. Gainsborough's father was a trader in fine materials. And so, in a way, was his son. If you ever get a chance to examine closely a portrait by Gainsborough in his prime, have a good look at the clothes they're wearing. The silks, the satins, the brocades, the lace. He had a genius for painting precious fabrics. He knew about them from birth and loved them dizzily, I think. Picture after picture by Gainsborough at his best is a glorious advert for his father's calling. Even Mrs. Andrews, the baddie in this picture, gets an outfit to die for. Pale blue silk in an outrageous expanse. Not what you'd usually wear if you're out killing pheasants. I get the feeling in a lot of Gainsborough's pictures that he liked the clothes more than he liked the people wearing them. He was notoriously unimpressed by his sitters. When he was painting Sarah Siddons, the most celebrated actress of her times, the Elizabeth Hurley of the Georgian age, he suddenly exploded, "Damn your nose, there's no end to it." And behind the backs of his sitters, he was even more scathing.
Yes, he was known to complain about his sitters, but I think being a portraitist is really a considerable problem, that you have all these people who by definition want to look better than they probably do. And that, having that day in, day out of about 8 people a day, must be a considerable problem. And most portraitists got very, very bored with self-important people rushing through their studio all day.
Gainsborough hated doing fashionable portraits. The cursed face business, he called it. His tragedy was, he was so damn good at it. "They only have one part worth looking at," said Gainsborough of the fashionable types he painted, "and that is their purse." So he sniffed the air and headed for where the biggest purses were gathered. He moved to Bath, where all the celebrities of Georgian England would visit to take the waters and to have their likeness done by Thomas Gainsborough, the Mario Testino of his age. He ended up in London, naturally, the most fashionable portrait painter in England, who was usually forgiven his little rudenesses because he captured a likeness better than anyone else. He had the gift all right. Gainsborough had the fastest hands of any painter this country's ever produced. He painted like an expert swordsman. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. And the rich have always been able to take a bit of rudeness from their artists in return for some breathtaking immortality.
He realised that he had to cover a vast amount of canvas in order to compete with people. There are 1 or 2 records of head and shoulder portraits which he completed in 1 hour 40 minutes, and that is going at sensational speed. There's records of him getting drunk for a fortnight and then doing a skirt of a great full-length portrait in a night. So I think he used that speed to good effect so that he could get drunk for a fortnight, and also so that he could get through the acreage of canvas and compete in a real way.
Gainsborough was the youngest of 9 children. His father, the cloth merchant, fell on hard times and was bankrupt. Young Thomas wasn't going to enter the cloth business. He had another talent, art. And according to a story, which I don't quite believe, but I'll tell you anyway, when he was a boy, he saw a man trying to steal pears from his garden and drew him so convincingly that the neighbours recognised this scoundrel immediately and nabbed him. young Gainsborough was also naughty. Another story, which I do believe, is that he used to forge his own sick notes for school and captured his parents' handwriting perfectly. From his days of forging sick notes at school and throughout his life, Gainsborough was a subtle subversive, always doing things on the sly. At the age of 18, he got married in secret to the illegitimate daughter of a duke. He'd got her pregnant. She brought in £200 a year, which was very useful, and which Gainsborough began to supplement busily by painting some of the most memorable portraits in British art. This is the house the Gainsboroughs lived in. It's an estate agent's now, and no one seems to know what went on in which room. But it could be that this is the spot in which Gainsborough painted Mr. and Mrs. Andrews. These days, the picture hangs in the National Gallery and is famous the world over as Gainsborough's earliest masterpiece. But until 50 years ago, no one outside the Andrews family even knew it existed. The National Gallery didn't buy it until 1960. So here's an interesting question. Why was this painting kept so secret for so long? Andrews inherited half of the estate from his father, Aubrey's it was called. His wife brought in the other half when they married in 1748. So although it wasn't, strictly speaking, a marriage of convenience, it was certainly a most convenient marriage, which left both of them twice as rich as they had been. So far, so normal. Here are two small-town moneybags celebrating the union of two big-time purses. But something went wrong in the making of this much-moneyed wedding portrait. I often watch people walking past this entertaining picture and enjoy it a lot. But it's amazing how often they miss two crucial things about it. One is how frightening Mrs. Andrews is, but the second is that it's unfinished. If you look closely at that brown splodge in the middle of her lap, something's missing. The picture is incomplete. Gainsborough never had his final say in this painting. He meant to show something here, but never did. What was it? And why did he never put it there? Why is Mr. and Mrs. Andrews unfinished? These are the questions that need to be asked. Here you have a painting that's famous the world over as the perfect image of rural England. But just as paradise had a snake in it, so Mrs. Andrews had on her lap something that never got painted, something that someone somewhere didn't want us to see. And I'm sure I know what it is. The single most aggressive and destructive act ever perpetrated by the government of Britain on its rural folk was the long and drawn-out passing of the Enclosure Acts, which took the common land away from the people, put a fence around it, and gave it to the landlords. It was unforgivable. It ruined the livings of so many country people. Gainsborough's heart always went out to them. The poor had his sympathy, not the rich and the landed, like Mr. and Mrs. Robert Andrews. This is the exact spot on which Gainsborough painted his wonderful picture. You must recognise that oak behind me, this big fat English oak, which is exactly the same tree, although it's thicker now than it was before. And over there, of course, is that beautiful slab of the English countryside, which is behind Mr. and Mrs. Andrews in the picture. Still, I think, really recognisable. Now, Mr. Andrews is standing just about here. He's been out hunting, so he's holding his shooting rifle nonchalantly under his arm. Mrs. Andrews, she's sitting here, demurely, with her legs crossed. Now, I've seen this picture so many times in the National Gallery, but it wasn't until I came here and stood in this spot that I realised something incredibly interesting about it, which is that behind Gainsborough in the painting, hidden from sight, is the house in which Mr. and Mrs. Andrews actually lived. Now that's significant, not just because you didn't know it was there in the painting, but also because it explains one of the great mysteries of Mr. and Mrs. Andrews, which is why she is dressed in this flamboyant outfit of flowing pale blue silk, while he is wearing his scruffy shooting gear. Obviously what's happened is that he's been out doing the shooting while she has been waiting for him indoors and has now come out to meet him just a few hundred feet away from the house to sit on his bench. The biggest change in the landscape, of course, is this huge row of trees behind me. There's a forest down there now that isn't in the Gainsborough picture. Now that was planted deliberately by one of the later owners of the house. Apparently they built a council estate at the bottom of the hill. So the owner decided to try and mask it, and he planted this huge forest in between it and him. The corn's gone, of course, it's all been grassed over now, but if you look carefully, you can actually still see the echoes of these furrows. There's little bits of them left. And what's interesting about the furrows is that they're what's left over from this revolutionary new use of an implement called the seed drill. Now, this seed drill was the very latest in agrarian technology. It made harvesting the corn so much easier, and Mr. Andrews was very proud of being a pioneer in its use.
The seed drill wasn't widely taken up initially. Wealthy landowners were keen to use it as it was a public demonstration of how wealthy and how advanced they were. It wasn't received widely by the majority, especially the farm workers. In fact, they could see with this change, with mechanisation coming in, that actually their jobs would be at threat.
Mr. and Mrs. Andrews, these newlyweds, are showing off the fruit of their union, their land and their agricultural progressiveness. Of course, there isn't a peasant in sight, and none of this was achieved by these two getting their hands dirty in any way.
What the painting shows to me is the importance of the new farming methods to him, and it's a real statement that he's actually, a very wealthy, powerful landowner and really accepting all these new ideas. And it's sort of really, look at me, I'm so, really ahead of the game.
People say that Gainsborough was having a go at the rural rich in this picture. I think that's right. He was. These are greedy people. They've snatched the land away from its rightful owners, and they're parading themselves in front of it, while Gainsborough disapproves. But there's something else going on here, something more personal. If Gainsborough really did go to school with Mr. Andrews, I think he rather liked him. Mr. Andrews is sympathetically painted. He's dim but nice, lounging around on his land with his gun and his dog. It's Mrs. Andrews who worries me. She's surely one of the least attractive women in Gainsborough's art. Uptight, clenched, stiff. She's only a teenager, 18 years old, but she already has the demeanour of a middle-aged rural harridan. And what is that on her lap, that unfinished blob of canvas? I think there's only one thing it can be. That must be a feather. The tail feather of a cock pheasant, I warrant, and the rest of the bird is sitting on her knee. He's been out hunting, he's brought the bird back, she's got it on her lap, on a cloth, so that it doesn't bleed into her beautiful blue dress. But if that is a cock pheasant, what's it doing there? Is the dead bird an innocent avian corpse brought back from the morning's hunt and no more? Or does it have another meaning, a deeper one, a symbolic one? Gainsborough was a great admirer of Dutch art. And in Dutch art, you often find women, wenches, shopgirls, wives, holding up dead birds, cocks, snipe, duck, Look at this buxom butcher's maid. How fiercely she clutches that cock. Look at her unsmiling determination. Does it remind you of anyone? The fact is that most dead birds in Dutch art represent a man who's fallen into the clutches of a determined woman and been plucked. The bird in the hand of a buxom Dutch woman is invariably intended as a warning to us guys not to let ourselves be grabbed where it hurts. And all the naughty double entendres involving the word cock are entirely intentional. Gainsborough, a countryman, would have known all about these low country readings, and he would, I suggest, have been after just such a double entendre in his picture before it was censored. I think that he didn't like Mrs. Andrews much, that he was warning Mr. Andrews of the fate of the cock pheasant that's fallen into her lap and been grabbed. Just before this picture was finished, I think its secret meaning was spotted, and that Mrs. Andrews realised all too clearly how unflattering a portrait of her was being painted here. The picture was never finished because the sitters finally realised what Gainsborough was saying about them and didn't like it. Ah yes, the English countryside. The corn in the field, the larks in the sky, and the poison in the hearts of the people. Mr. and Mrs. Andrews is a great masterpiece of Gainsborough's early work, but if only he'd been allowed to complete it, it would have been greater still. There are a million stories in the world of art. This has been just one of them. If you want to find stolen paintings, don't go looking in the houses of robbers and burglars. Go to a museum. Here at the National Gallery in London, for instance, there's a very, very famous painting that shouldn't really be here because, to put it bluntly, it was nicked. The National Gallery acquired the so-called Arnolfini marriage in 1842 from a Scottish soldier who'd fought in the Peninsular War in Spain. Before the Peninsular War, the painting belonged to the Spanish royal family. After the Peninsular War, it belonged to the Scottish soldier. You work it out. This is war booty. And if I were a member of the Spanish royal family, I'd be on the phone every day asking for it back. Because not only is this one of the world's most famous pictures, it's also one of the most gloriously mysterious. What exactly is it that Jan van Eyck has painted here? Something meaningful is obviously going on, but what can it be? Art historians have tied themselves into knots trying to unravel the mystery. Round and round and round they go. There have been hundreds of interpretations, but so successfully has this masterpiece of puzzlement confused its interpreters that the most fashionable theory currently doing the rounds is that there is no mystery to it, that it's just a portrait of Mr. and Mrs. Arnolfini, and that's it. That's what it says here. the National Gallery's own catalogue. No secret setup, no mystery, no hidden meaning. But that has to be wrong. The Arnolfini marriage must have a hidden meaning. The picture's packed with symbolism, and frankly, you'd have to be blind not to notice it. Look, for instance, at this fruit here on the windowsill. It says in the catalogue that the fruit is only here to indicate that the man in the picture is wealthy. He's a rich merchant, and rich merchants flaunt their wealth by leaving oranges, which were expensive, scattered casually about the room. What poppycock! All you have to do to see that this fruit must have some deeper symbolic meaning is to look at other pictures by Jan van Eyck. Look what's on the windowsill of this Madonna and Child from Frankfurt. Is she trying to show how rich she is? Look at the windowsill of the Ince Hall Madonna. Why would this Virgin Mary be flaunting her wealth? She isn't. In Van Eyck's Madonnas, the fruit arranged so pointedly on the windowsill is a deliberate reminder of those notorious biblical events in the Garden of Eden that led to us being thrown out of paradise. When Adam took a bite out of the fruit being proffered to him by Eve, he committed the first sin and ensured the fall of man. The fruit on the windowsills of Van Eyck's Madonnas reminds us of the consequences of our inability to resist temptation. There's also a tree full of cherries visible through the window of the Arnolfini's room, and that isn't accidental either. Cherries were the traditional fruits of paradise. They represented what we've lost, what we could have had. That's why the infant Jesus is brandishing handfuls of cherries at us enthusiastically in the recently rediscovered Madonna of the Cherries by Joos van Cleve. The baby Jesus has come down to earth to atone for our sins by dying for us. And because of his ultimate sacrifice, it'll be cherries all round for us again in heaven. My point is that these cherries in the Arnolfini's garden and the fruit arranged so pointedly on the Arnolfini's windowsill is there for a reason. Everything in this busy painting is there for a reason. So let's be braver than the cataloguers of the National Gallery. Let's take the difficult path, not the easy one, and have another go at cracking the code of the Arnolfini marriage. Not much is known about the painter Jan van Eyck. We know that he worked for the Dukes of Burgundy in the 1420s, travelled here and there, and ended up in Bruges as the city's greatest artist. Bruges today is the premier tourist destination in Belgium, and one of the best preserved medieval cities in Europe. But in Van Eyck's time here, the 1430s, this delightfully preserved chocolate box town was the most important trading port in Northern Europe. Bruges was international, busy, and very, very rich.
In the 1430s, Bruges must have been a very cosmopolitan place. Goods were transported from all over Europe and found their way here. From the Baltic region and further out east came, for instance, furs and all sorts of animal skins. From the Mediterranean came things like spices, exotic foods, but also textile. And textile was the main business of Bruges.
Among all these precious stuffs being exported from Bruges all round Europe, perhaps the most valuable of all in the long run was oil paints, which was said to have been invented here by Van Eyck himself. It wasn't true, of course. Oil painting developed gradually in various places, but it is true that Van Eyck was the first great master of the new medium, and this made him internationally famous. It's said that this is his self-portrait, and I believe it. This is a man who knows what he wants. The thing about oil paints is that they could achieve amazingly convincing, illusionistic effects. Painters could paint things with them that looked miraculously real, and no one was better at this than Jan van Eyck. One of the reasons this stubbornly mysterious picture has proved so enduringly fascinating is because Van Eyck involves you in the action so cunningly. At the front of the picture, the mysterious couple seem to be greeting you, as if you've just entered the room and they've been waiting for you. At the back of the picture, the famous wall mirror, so perfectly painted, not only shows the back of the couple, as you'd expect, but also two more figures entering the room. It's been said that the first of these is Van Eyck himself, but surely it must also represent whoever's looking at the picture, whoever's just stepped into the room. In other words, you. We can confidently identify the two people in the painting as Mr. and Mrs. Arnolfini. Their names appear in a couple of early documents, misspelt but still recognisable. The Arnolfini were a family of Italian merchants from Lucca in Tuscany who settled in Bruges and traded in precious materials, fabrics, silks and gold. Van Eyck painted the distinctive man in the picture twice, and for a long time he was thought to be Giovanni di Arrigo Arnolfini, but recent research has suggested it may actually have been his cousin, Giovanni di Niccolao Arnolfini, who arrived in Bruges in 1419. We know that this Giovanni di Niccolao was married. We also know that his wife died. Giovanni was conspicuously prosperous, and in Bruges in the 1430s, a huge proportion of a man's wealth was tied up in his clothes.
Well, he's wearing a fur-lined velvet garment known at the time as a hauk, and it seems to be made of purple crimson velvet, which would make it extraordinarily expensive. But her dress, the white fur, if indeed, as has been suspected, that the fur is the fur of the squirrel, then it's only the belly fur. And you're talking literally hundreds, if not thousands, of animals going into one of those gowns alone. And they were environmental disaster areas from our point of view. And by the end of the 15th century, the fur trade in Europe seems to more or less have wiped out the local wildlife, and they were very lucky to find the New World to go and exploit.
So the Arnolfinis are dressed up to the nines in their finest finery. Why would that be? It was an art historian called Erwin Panofsky who came up with a theory in the 1930s that what Van Eyck is actually showing us is the Arnolfinis' marriage. Panofsky claimed that Van Eyck himself and the other chap you see reflected miraculously in the mirror were the two witnesses at the wedding, and that the picture was actually intended as a legal document, which is why it sports that huge Rumpold of the Bailey signature at its centre. Jan van Eyck was here. Unfortunately, to arrive at this fabulous theory, Panofsky needed to twist around some of the evidence and in a couple of instances actually make stuff up. And I reckon that today's fashion for insisting that the painting is nothing more than a portrait of a rich Flemish merchant and his wife is an embarrassed reaction by modern art historians to Panofsky's creative tinkering with the facts. But in dismissing all of Panofsky's theories about the Arnolfini marriage, are we perhaps chucking out the baby with the bathwater? Indeed, isn't the issue of the baby the first thing that needs to be considered here? And don't tell me that there isn't a baby. It says here that Mrs. Arnolfini isn't pregnant. It says here that this lovely bulge in her stomach is just the way her dress was cut, a fashion of the times. Well, I don't buy that. And I don't believe that anyone looking at her with genuinely open eyes can miss this protective gesture of hers. She's pregnant, all right, and this pregnancy is the key to the picture's meaning. Pregnancy is such a critical and ubiquitous human condition that you'd have expected art to be packed with images of pregnant women. After all, what could be a more important family event to celebrate and record than the expected arrival of a new baby? And indeed, there are lots of pregnant women in art. Rather amazingly, however, they tend to get overlooked. I don't think I've puzzled over any picture as much as I've puzzled over the so-called Arnolfini marriage. It's a maddening thing. It sends you all over the place looking for clues. And one day, by chance, it sent me here to the huge and grand Metropolitan Museum in New York. I was walking through this room and I saw this. You want evidence of pregnancy? This is evidence of pregnancy. It's by Joos van Cleve, who worked in Antwerp, so close to Bruges. This is Van Cleve's Annunciation. The angel Gabriel has come to tell Mary that she's about to become the mother of Jesus Christ. What a big moment. Isn't this space familiar? Isn't the bed familiar? Aren't those candles familiar? Isn't the window familiar? Isn't the mood familiar? This Annunciation bears such an obvious and tangible resemblance to the Arnolfini marriage that it might almost be the same setup. You encounter the same arrangement in other heartfelt Annunciations by artists who followed Van Eyck. A similar room, a similar bed, a similar atmosphere of a proclaimed baby. Now, of course, the Arnolfini marriage doesn't show the angel Gabriel coming down to the Virgin Mary and telling her she's about to have Jesus. But look at this. It's just too similar to be a coincidence. Van Eyck's masterpiece is trying to plunge us into atmospheres exactly like these, the warm and holy atmospheres of an impending birth. So I've come up with a blunt and honest and no-nonsense title for Van Eyck's oh-so-complicated masterpiece. Let's get to the point here. We should call this the Arnolfini pregnancy. This is a selection of portraits by Marcus Giretz the Younger, who worked in England in the late 1500s, but whose father was an immigrant from Bruges. It's only recently been noticed that all the women in these portraits are pregnant. Why was Marcus Giretz the Younger commissioned to paint all these pregnant women? Because birth in Giretz's day was an event brimming over with fatal significance. Pregnancy was something not only to be celebrated, but also to be feared.
There was a perception that the mortality rate in childbirth was much higher, And women approach childbirth, some with a lot of anxiety. You know, it would be a period, pregnancy would be a period in which you would do spiritual exercises. You would be thinking about the strong possibility of dying in childbirth. So it made me think that that might be an aspect of the portraits. If the woman died in childbirth, there would be a record, an image of her. It would take its place in the family portrait gallery.
Thus, life and death are intertwined in the pregnancy portraits of Marcus Giretz, as they must somehow be intertwined in the Arnolfini marriage. A brave, free-thinking art historian thinks she's found the answer.
Many people challenge the suggestion that the woman is actually pregnant because of a painting by Van Eyck which showed Saint Catherine of Alexandria, who's obviously a virgin saint, in a similar dress and pose. And therefore it was argued that it was impossible that a person could be shown in that same pose and dress and necessarily be pregnant. On the other hand, Saint Catherine of Alexandria was mystically married to Christ. And so therefore, it does actually make sense that they could, if not literally pregnant, perhaps a suggestion of pregnancy is intended. There was a discovery in the archives in Florence, which is a letter from Mrs. Arnolfini's mother. And in this letter she mentions, and it's dated 1433, the year before this picture is dated, she mentions that her daughter Costanza had died. I decided that it might be possible to think of it another way, which is that this woman in the picture was actually portrayed posthumously. That is to say that she's actually dead by the time the painting is completed. And at first it seems very far-fetched, but in fact when looking at a lot of the details in the painting, I think that it's very convincing that this was in fact the case. So I would argue that it's very likely Mrs. Arnolfini died in childbirth. And there are other reasons to think that. Behind her, over her right shoulder, you can see the back of a chair which has the image of a Saint Margaret praying behind the dragon, which is her attribute. Saint Margaret was the patron saint of pregnant women. The scenes around the convex mirror are illustrations of the Passion, which seems very interesting in terms of the division of Mr. Arnolfini and Mrs. Arnolfini. That is, the dead scenes on her side, the living scenes on his. Similarly, if you look at the chandelier up above, there is again a contrast of the lit candle still on the left side where Arnolfini is, and on the right his wife stands underneath a candle that's gone out. I would argue that in light of this idea that this is a posthumous image of Mrs. Arnolfini, certain aspects of the painting that were mysterious seem much more straightforward.
So Mrs. Arnolfini may have died in childbirth, and Mr. Arnolfini may have chosen to memorialize her in this poignant masterpiece by Jan van Eyck. Arnolfini presents his wife to us with that touching gesture of his, as if she were still alive. Why does he do that? Because I think the painting is trying to understand her death and the baby's death in intensely religious terms by comparing their sacrifice with the ultimate sacrifice of Jesus Christ, crucified on the cross up here in the mirror, right in the middle of the picture. The fruit in the window reminds us of those regrettable events in the Garden of Eden that brought death into the world and robbed us all of eternal life. And see these funny shoes, pattens they're called. They're for wearing outdoors. You slip them over your other shoes. Well, Mr. Arnolfini has discarded his so very pointedly. Despite what's happened to him, he has no plans to wander further. He's promising his fidelity to his wife and to his faith. And Van Eyck, because he was a genius, manages to indicate all this with oodles of clever symbolism. But he also captures the haunting self-absorption and all that repressed sadness and even anger in the face of Mr. Arnolfini. There are a million stories in the world of art. This has been just one of them. '63 was such an important year in the history of the world. In America, where the Civil War was raging, slavery was abolished, and President Abraham Lincoln promised his country government of the people, by the people, for the people. In England, the first underground line was opened between Paddington and Farringdon. In Switzerland, the Red Cross was founded, and here in France, this went on show and caused the biggest scandal the world of art had ever witnessed. Idiotic, wretched, shocking, incoherent, childish, raged the papers of the day, taking huge offence at Manet's Déjeuner sur l'herbe, the picnic on the grass. They didn't like the nude, they didn't like the men, they didn't like the colour scheme, they didn't like the composition. What upset them most, though, was this provocative way in which the men in this picture were dressed, but she wasn't. Not only was this woman flagrantly naked, but, worse, she didn't give a damn. No, she just looked right back at her audience with that extraordinary stare of hers and dared them to disapprove. It was almost as if she was accusing them. Our own Dante Gabriel Rossetti, the pre-Raphaelite, would later write a horrified letter home about this French idiot named Manet, who must be the greatest and most uncritical ass who ever lived. Nasty. They were all wrong, of course. People invariably are when they get all worked up about an artwork. But very few pictures can claim to have changed the course of art single-handedly. This, however, is one of them. I'll just spell it out for you. Without this picture, there wouldn't have been Impressionism. And without Impressionism, there wouldn't have been modern art. And we'll talk about all that, what Manet was trying to do here, what he achieved, why this thing had the impact it did. But on a more personal note, can I also question the eyesight of all those critics who, in 1863, found this woman ugly? Who complained about her figure and laughed at her? Were they all blind? This woman isn't ugly. This is one of the most desirable and alluring women in art. And when Manet found her, his art found a raison d'être. Here she is, and her again. Who was she? You'll find out.
The thing that bothered people with the déjeuner, I think, I mean, from all this distance, is the look of that woman. There she sat on the lawn, with these men in their, student garb, young men, and she could care less. Well, it's outrageous. I think that must have driven men who wrote about her, crazy.
Manet was the son of a very rich and very prominent French judge. Auguste Manet, he was called. He was a holder of the Légion d'honneur, and here at the Palais de Justice, Manet Senior was at the top of the judge's tree and held one of the most important legal positions in France. His mother was a genuine blue blood. Her godfather was the King of Sweden, and in fact the current kings of Sweden are all descended from him. So with a father who presided over the Palais de Justice and a mother mixed up with royalty, Manet came from an unusually distinguished family. He was the eldest son, born in 1832, and as so often happened in such situations, his father hoped he'd continue the family tradition and become a lawyer, while Edouard himself dreamt of the opposite. He dreamt of becoming an artist. With Manet, more than with most artists, the choice between respectability and rebellion was so very loaded. Manet chose rebellion. He signed up as an apprentice in the studio of a flashy and immensely popular academic painter called Thomas Couture, a peddler of huge, fleshy, pompous fantasies packed with ancient nudes. This one shows the day after the night before at a Roman orgy. It's soft porn done with oil paints. But because the girls were dressed, or rather undressed, as Romans, Couture was forgiven. In Manet's world, this was acceptable. But this was shocking.
The Déjeuner sur l'herbe is just frankly provocative. It was obviously completely immoral for a modern-dressed woman to be seating naked with two fully clothed men. If you had river gods and nymphs and so on, of course that was absolutely fine, but not people who were absolutely, obviously, explicitly contemporary in their clothes.
Rather surprisingly, Manet's father accepted his son's decision to become an artist and generously provided the money for Manet's upkeep and education. It can't have been easy for Auguste Manet to sponsor and fund his son's rebellion, and it certainly wasn't in character. So let me plant some seeds of suspicion here about his reasons for doing it. Perhaps Auguste Manet wasn't as respectable as he pretended to be. Perhaps Edouard knew something about his father that the father didn't want others to know. Perhaps Manet Jr. had something on Manet Senior. This is Manet's wife, Suzanne Leenhoff. When Manet was a teenager, this Suzanne, who was from Holland, joined the family as a piano teacher. She gave piano lessons to Manet and his brothers. Now, something very mysterious happened with Suzanne, because in 1852, she gave birth to a baby. And this baby, a boy called Léon, went on to appear in many of Manet's pictures. And because Manet eventually married Suzanne 10 years later, it's always been assumed that Léon was Manet's son. But what if he wasn't? What if someone else were the father? What if someone else made Suzanne Leenhoff pregnant? What disgrace this would have brought to the family if it had come out. Who among the Manets needed most to preserve an aura of respectability around himself? A lot of very convincing circumstantial evidence points to Auguste Manet being the father of little Léon and not Edouard. And if he was, as I believe he was, then the painting of Déjeuner-sur-l'Herbe, begun in the year of Auguste Manet's death, would have been informed by a highly personal understanding of the shallowness of respectability and the power of lust and the prevalence of hypocrisy. Oh yes, I'm going to tell you everything that went into the making of this picture, but some of it you may not want to know. First thing to note about Déjeuner-sur-l'Herbe is that the scene Manet's showing us is actually illegal. Men and women weren't allowed to bathe together in Manet's time, and they certainly weren't allowed to go naked in public. When they did go bathing in the river, they wore very proper swimming costumes and were separated by big wire fences. So everyone seeing Déjeuner would have known immediately that Manet was deliberately teasing the law, mocking it. And the person who would have known this more clearly than anyone else, had he still been alive to see it, would have been Manet's father. The most obviously and outrageously illegal participant in this outdoor orgy, which is what people would have thought they were looking at, was that wonderful nude who sits there on the left and stares out at us so implacably. I've already admitted how much I personally admire, I fancy, the naked woman in Déjeuner-sur-l'Herbe. Well, her name was Victorine Meurent, and her story is fascinating.
Victorine Meurent was born in Paris, and she lived in a working-class neighborhood. I can't imagine her just being a model. I think that the passivity of modeling is not something that suits or goes with the look of that woman. Some dreadful stories exist of Victorine. People seeing her outside the World's Fair, begging for money or being drunk. For me, that was always a reading. You know how these people knew her as Manet's model, which is fairly close to being a prostitute. And so then when they see her again, they read all of that into it and have her dead at, 50 practically. So when we learned that she was a painter and exhibited at the Salon, and even late in her 80s, when asked by someone doing a census what she did, and she identified herself as an artist, I think it was a vision she had of herself. So in a way, her life, I don't know, I suppose you could say her life was ordinary, but I find it rather extraordinary that, first of all, that this working class girl could have ever imagined herself an artist. How did she ever get the idea that that's what she could do? I love her for that. I do, I just love her.
Manet was supposed to have met Victorine at the Palais de Justice, where his father presided over the courts. Manet Senior's task was to rule on domestic affairs, patrimony suits, affairs of illegitimacy and inheritance. Victorine was a part-time model and a street singer, so she was exactly typical of the kind of women who were always being brought before Manet Senior, accused of enticing this man or that man. So there's a perfectly reasonable chance that Manet met Victorine while she was appearing before his father on some misdemeanor or other. What a splendid irony that is.
I definitely think there was chemistry of a sexual kind between Meurent and Manet. Even if she were gay, which I think she was. He talks about going to a party and Victorine being there with her girlfriend and their arms around each other and so on. So, whereas I never used to think of the two of them sexually engaged, I think they could have been sexually engaged without ever having sex, let me put it that way.
It's inevitably been whispered that Manet fell in love with Victorine, and certainly her looks did something to him as they do to me. He painted her obsessively and gloriously for a decade. Here she is in a matador's costume Manet had made specially for him by a Spanish tailor in Paris. This is her as a street singer leaving work. And here as a lady of the night who's just said goodbye to her respectable and two-faced Parisian lover. How do we know he's respectable and two-faced? Because, brilliantly, Manet's given Victorine a monocle to brandish. It can't be her monocle. Women didn't wear them. Old men whose eyesight was going wore monocles. Old men whose eyesight was going kept mistresses on the side. They sent posies of flowers to indicate they were coming. They feigned respectability in the daytime and then searched out what they really wanted at night. This is Manet's other famously scandalous picture. Olympia, she's called. It's Victorine again, so lovely, so brazen. What's happening in this picture is that Olympia, a courtesan, is greeting her next client, me, or you, or whoever's looking at the picture, because we've just arrived and we've brought her a bouquet of flowers. And just look at the expression on Victorine's face. What thoughtfulness, what sadness, what pity. And here's an interesting detail. See this bracelet? It's apparently a bracelet that Manet gave to his wife, and inside it was a lock of his hair. Now, what to make of that? I'm not sure. But I think it underlines how Manet's art becomes extra personal in matters of sexual desire and respectability and the keeping of mistresses. And I think we have to bear that in mind when we go outside again and take a closer look at Déjeuner sur l'herbe.
There was a lot of anxiety about the morality of women in Paris in the 1860s. What people were most afraid of was the sense that you couldn't tell who people were. You couldn't tell the difference between respectable people and non-respectable people. So all the way there was a sense that you couldn't read modern woman.
So here's Victorine Mourant, naked, brazen, a biche, a lorette, a prostitute, and opposite her, lounging about, is Manet's brother, Gustave, who's playing an art student in the picture. We know he's supposed to be an art student because he's wearing a silly hat, a type of indoor fez much favoured by students. The second man is Manet's brother-in-law, Ferdinand Lainhoff, the brother of Suzanne Lainhoff. Ferdinand was a sculptor. So these are real-life artistic types, pretending to be fictional artistic types, and flouting the law orgiastically in a studenty way. The question is, why? Manet's told us that the original inspiration for the Déjeuner was a terribly famous painting that hangs in the Louvre, of a concert champêtre, an outdoor music party involving a pair of costumed musicians and a pair of naked muses. In Manet's time, the painter of this old masterish ménage à quatre was believed to be the great Giorgione. More recently, Titian is said to have done it. Whichever of the two it was, the mood is luxurious, sensual, Venetian, and very decadent. Two men who are dressed frolic with two muses who aren't. Not surprisingly, this great painting has set many French imaginations racing. The actual composition of Déjeuner-sur-l'Herbe was based on a print by Marcantonio Raimondi of Raphael's Judgment of Paradise. So Manet's deliberately misquoting the old masters, taking on Raphael, taking on Giorgione, revisiting their scenarios and updating them. Déjeuner-sur-l'Herbe shows us what Giorgione's concert champêtre would have looked like if it had taken place by the Seine in 1863, rather than somewhere golden in Arcadia in the 16th century. It would have looked ridiculous, uncomfortable, and illegal. Thus, this naughty painting is an outrageous updating of the past, filled with deliberate shocks. For instance, what is that woman at the back actually doing? In Giorgione's concert champêtre, she's a lovely mythological muse, drawing a carafe of water from a sacred well. In Manet's painting, she's become a woman in a shift who's waded into the river and who cups the water with her hand. Now, I don't know if you've ever been on a beach with some French women. If you have, you'll know that they keep running into the water to have a pee. It's an unfortunate national habit. For the French, the entire Mediterranean is a giant outdoor bidet. And anyone looking at Manet's painting in the 19th century would have realised that Giorgione's water-bearing muse has become a woman having a pee. This deliberate sacrilege continues all around the picture. Look how sloppily the remains of the picnic have been dumped on the grass. See, in the corner, there's a frog skulking in the grass. A frog, grenouille in French, was student slang for a prostitute. So this picture hasn't just set out to update one of the great themes of the old masters, the outdoor concert. It's set out to have a laugh at the old masters' expense, to rub our noses in the absurdity of what the old masters showed us. Look up there in the middle. Can you see it? It's something people usually miss. It's a bullfinch, a common bird of the parks, yet look how uncommonly it's flying here, with its wings stretched out like that, flying over the centre of the composition. There's only one other bird in art that flies like that, right there in the middle. The sacred dove that represents the Holy Ghost in so many Renaissance baptisms. So we have here a flying bullfinch replacing the Holy Ghost and coming down to a woman having a pee. This isn't just a deliberately shocking picture, it's also a deliberately sacrilegious one, a picture hell-bent on transgression by an artist who's lost his submissive respect for the past and who's deliberately elbowing the old masters out of the frame and replacing them with the harsh truths of the modern world. It takes great arrogance to paint a picture like this. It takes chutzpah and Frenchness. But above all, I suggest, it takes an intense sense of personal disappointment, of being let down by the past, of no longer believing in a world you thought you could trust. And Manet had good reason to feel like that.